with phone calls to Sister Maureen, Sister Angela, Sister Dean. And we've been the great beneficiaries and privileged to actually be these pilgrims, and so I want to thank you. Because one of the things that we struggle with in teaching is to find ways of constantly renewing and coming up with great new projects for people to work on, and this one's been extraordinary. Instead of, we're going to partly do a sort of historic overview, but I think most of the people here know the history of this site, or at least its salient points. So I actually want to do something slightly different, and that is to think about what, again, Sister Angela talked about as unfolding. She's very clear when she gives us our opening prayers here, and when she talks about the site, that the biggest challenge is to take the history of this place, to deal with that in the present and project this site forward into the future in an important way. And I think that what I want to do is imagine some of the leading themes that we've found in working on the history of this site that are particularly relevant to what's happening today, and particularly what's going on in the future. And the first is to understand that what Philip St. George Koch was doing here in collaborating with Alexander Jackson Davis was to really understand buildings as integral elements of a broader landscape. That's certainly at the core, at the heart of the picturesque tradition that this house was designed to be part of. And that was to not to separate buildings from the broader landscape, but to understand that buildings are actually composed themselves as part of a broader landscape. And he was very, very clear about this when Philip St. George Koch wrote about what he wanted, what he was envisioning in terms of the design for this site. He said that he chose the irregular style because it is well adapted to features of the landscape. He understood, and in fact, he contrasted that with classicism. He said, I want this style because this building will fit my site and be composed as part of it. And our feeling, I think, is very strong that what we really need to do is think about the way in which the preservation of this building has us reflecting on a much broader site. And so for him, it was partly that it was connected to this entire picturesque tradition that's emerging in the 18th and early 19th century that he's very much a part of. And you look at his library, it's full of the tracts and the records of the picturesque tradition. He owns a library full of books by Sir Walter Scott. He owns the leading landscape treatises that really are laying out the connection between architectural design and landscape design. And so he, interestingly, how are we going to advance? Is this for me? No, we don't. Let's see. Okay. This is a image of Belmead that shows up in Andrew Jackson Downing's Horticulturalist magazine. And in some ways, this represented a coming full cycle for Davis's design and for Koch's project. Because what happened is that Philip St. George Koch decided on Davis as his architect. How? By reading Andrew Jackson Downing. And he had gone through Downing's books and through the Horticulturalist. And the architect that caught his eye was Alexander Jackson Davis. And he said, I want my house on the banks of the James to be designed by this architect who was representing some of the highest picturesque ideals as Downing was capturing them in his own literature. And so what's extraordinary is he goes and gets Davis to design the house, and then the house ends up as a cut in Downing's Horticulturalist magazine. So this is coming full cycle. He not only said he wanted Davis to do the design and wanted it to be done in the picturesque irregular style that was familiar from Downey. He also said, I want this house that I'm designing to be as close as possible to the cut that shows up on page 920 of Claudius Loudon's Cyclopedia of Landscape and Villa Architecture. And so he actually has this, and this is Koch's edition of this, which is now at the University of Virginia Library. And Loudon is the leading landscape theorist and proponent of picturesque design in England at this time. And so you have Philip St. George Koch just connecting himself directly to this theory of design, which says, again, that there should be a reciprocal relationship between buildings and the broader landscape. And he is working in that, and the basic notion is that a building that has pointed windows and the turrets and pinnacles on the tower is, again, it's as if it's another bosque of trees on the landscape. And so this connection to the landscape, which I know the sisters care about deeply, is one that you can actually say, that's an element of this long history that we can draw on and that we want to draw on. This was the house that is out of Loudon's Cyclopedia that Koch said he wants adapted for design here. Again, this cyclopedia was published in 1833, and so he's actually reading the latest tracts coming out of picturesque design and saying, that's exactly what I want. And not only is there the house itself, but there's a dependency, a stable, which then ends up being the design he ends up with. The house there, and then about on this site that we're in right now, which was actually the first school addition, underneath that was the two-story kitchen building. Now, it wasn't just a style that, and here's that addition that no longer stands. It was not just a relationship about the big house and the landscape. He actually also had Davis design a number of outbuildings for this site. And this is a two-story, four-room slave quarter that was designed by Davis as part of this design. This is looking just this way, in this scaffolding going up around this wing of the school. So it's taken just when the school is opening in the 1890s, and these buildings were that close. So there was the two-story, four-room slave dwelling there, what is potentially a chapel, and then there's also a smokehouse. Now, the elements that were selected was this board and batten construction, which you can see, we'll see a little bit better, which is basically taking lumber off of this site, rough hewing it through the sawmill, standing up, very simple kind of construction, but again, these outbuildings were doing precisely what the house did, and that is being connected to this broader landscape. So it's not just about the big house, it's about buildings all across the site. And indeed, if you look at the stable that ended up on this property, same character, same quality, the embellished verge boards, all of this is central to other designs that Davis is doing in his residential practice. And so this was an aesthetic that was more